August 25th, 1944. Highway N13, somewhere between Saint-Lô and Chartres, France. The steering wheel vibrated under Sergeant James Ruckard's calloused hands as his 2.5-ton GMC truck roared through the darkness at speeds that would have earned him a court-martial under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. In the cab beside him, his relief driver had fallen asleep despite the bone-jarring ride, exhausted after driving continuously since dawn. Through the dust-caked windshield, Ruckard could see an endless ribbon of red taillights stretching ahead into the French countryside, and in his mirrors, more headlights behind, each truck carrying 5 tons of gasoline, ammunition, or rations that General George Patton's Third Army desperately needed to keep pushing toward Germany. What the Axis leaders in Berlin had dismissed as impossible was unfolding before the eyes of thousands of German soldiers retreating across France. The Americans, they had been assured by their intelligence officers, could never maintain supply lines stretching hundreds of kilometers from the Normandy beaches. Their logistics would collapse under their own weight. The advance would stall within weeks. Victory would be Germany's through superior organization and battlefield experience. Every assumption the Wehrmacht High Command had made about American logistical capacity was about to be shattered by an operation conceived in desperation and executed with relentless determination. The mathematics that would decide the European theatre were being written not in artillery shells or tank armor, but in tire treads on French highways and in the sweat-soaked uniforms of drivers who would not stop rolling. The collapse of German confidence had begun on July 25, 1944, when Operation Cobra shattered the stalemate in Normandy. For 7 weeks after D-Day, more than 1 million Allied soldiers had been compressed into a bridgehead roughly 50 miles wide and 20 miles deep, an area about half the size of Long Island. The German 7th Army, though battered and depleted, had managed to contain the Allied advance through the murderous hedgerow country of Normandy, where every field became a fortress and every lane a kill zone. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, commanding Army Group B, had reported to Berlin with cautious optimism that the Allies were exhausting themselves against German defensive positions. The Americans, he assured Hitler, lacked the tactical sophistication to break through prepared defenses. The hedgerows, those ancient earth and stone walls covered with thorny vegetation that divided every Norman field, had become Germany's unexpected ally, turning every advance into a deadly close-quarters battle. Then came the hammer blow. 2,400 American heavy bombers carpet-bombed a rectangle 5 miles wide and 1.5 miles deep south of Saint-Lô, dropping 4,000 tons of high explosives in less than an hour. The earth itself seemed to convulse under the onslaught. German soldiers who survived described a landscape transformed into a moonscape, where trees were stripped of branches, buildings reduced to powder, and men were found dead without visible wounds, killed by concussion alone. Communication trenches collapsed, command posts were buried, artillery pieces were tossed like toys. The bombing created a temporary wasteland through which American armor could pour. Within days, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's forces had punched through the shattered German lines, and Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army, officially activated on August 1st, exploded into the breakthrough like a coiled spring released after months of compression. Patton's armoured spearheads began racing across France at speeds that shocked both sides. On some days, elements of his army covered more than 80 miles, distances that German planners had calculated would require weeks to achieve while maintaining supply lines. In Berlin, the operations officers at Oberkommando des Heeres studied their maps with growing alarm. The blue arrows representing American forces were moving faster than their red situation markers could be updated. Entire German divisions were being bypassed, surrounded, or simply scattered by the speed of the American advance. Something was fundamentally wrong with their calculations about American capabilities. Colonel Klaus von Steinberg, a logistics officer with the 7th Army Staff, would later write in his memoir about his growing realization that German intelligence had catastrophically underestimated American capabilities. He wrote candidly about the assumptions that had guided German planning. They had calculated that the American supply chain would require 1 truck for every 5 soldiers, similar to German ratios. They believed American advances would bog down 30 kilometers beyond operational railheads, as German advances had in Russia. They were measuring American capacity by German standards, by German limitations. This, he concluded, was their fatal error. The error became apparent on August 15th, when Steinberg's unit encountered an American supply column near Argentan. His description captured the shock of that moment. The convoy stretched as far as they could see. Not dozens of trucks, not even hundreds. Thousands. All identical GMC vehicles. All moving at the same steady pace, all laden with supplies. German supply columns, by contrast, consisted of a motley collection of requisitioned French vehicles, captured Soviet trucks, horse-drawn wagons, and a handful of precious German military lorries. Half of German transport could not maintain highway speeds. The Americans appeared to have an inexhaustible supply of identical modern vehicles, all moving with mechanical precision that spoke to industrial capacity Germany could not match. What Steinberg had witnessed was the leading edge of an operation that would become legend, though at the time it had not yet received its famous name. On August 21st, 1944, as Patton's Third Army and Courtney Hodges' First Army pushed deeper into France, Allied commanders faced a logistics crisis of staggering proportions. 28 divisions were advancing on a front stretching from Brittany to the German border. Each division, when actively engaged, consumed approximately 700 to 750 tons of supplies daily. Combat divisions burned through ammunition at prodigious rates. Tanks consumed fuel measured in gallons per mile rather than miles per gallon. Soldiers needed rations, medical supplies, replacement clothing, and thousands of other items. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Approximately 21,000 tons per day needed to be moved from the Normandy beaches to units that were already 200 to 300 miles inland and moving farther east every day. The crisis had been manufactured by Allied success. In the months before D-Day, Allied air forces had systematically destroyed the French railway network to prevent German reinforcements from reaching Normandy. Bridges lay in ruins, marshalling yards were cratered wastelands, rail lines had been cut in thousands of places. Locomotives and rolling stock had been destroyed wherever they could be found. The destruction that had paralyzed German logistics in June and prevented massive counterattacks against the beachhead was now threatening to strangle the Allied advance in August. The ports of Brittany, where initial planning had assumed supplies would flow, remained in German hands. Hitler had ordered these ports held to the last man, and German garrisons were fighting with fanatical determination. The massive port facilities at Antwerp would not be liberated until early September and would not become operational until late November, after the Scheldt estuary was cleared. Everything had to come through the Normandy beaches and the recently captured port at Cherbourg, which was still being repaired from German demolitions. On August 23rd, in a 36-hour marathon planning session at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, transportation officers, quartermaster commanders, and operations staff officers crafted a solution that would have been dismissed as impossible under normal circumstances. Brigadier General Ewart Planck, tasked with organizing the operation, later described it as planning for organized chaos. The concept was simple but audacious. Commandeer every available truck from units across Normandy. Create dedicated one-way highways closed to all civilian traffic. Run a continuous conveyor belt of supplies from Normandy to the front lines, operating around the clock, 7 days a week, until either the port at Antwerp opened or the trucks wore out, whichever came first. The name came from American railroad tradition dating back to the 1890s. Express freight trains carrying perishables or priority cargo were marked with red balls, and all other traffic was required to yield to them. Railroad men had used the term for decades to indicate absolute priority. The name had been used earlier in the year for a British supply operation. Now it would be adopted for what would become the most famous truck convoy operation in military history, the Red Ball Express. The name itself carried the promise of urgency, priority, and relentless forward motion. Lieutenant Colonel Loren Ayres, known to his men as Little Patton for his demanding standards and aggressive style, was placed in command of assembling the operation. His orders were blunt and uncompromising. Find trucks, find drivers, and get it running in 4 days. No excuses, no delays. The advance could not wait. Ayres immediately began scouring units across Normandy like a man possessed. Artillery units were ordered to surrender their prime movers. Anti-aircraft battalions gave up their transport vehicles. 3 entire infantry divisions were stripped of their organic truck companies. Engineers contributed construction vehicles. Any unit whose duties were deemed not critical to immediate combat operations found itself contributing vehicles and drivers. Within 72 hours, working with minimal sleep and maximum urgency, Ayres had assembled a fleet of approximately 6,000 trucks, the vast majority of them 2.5-ton GMC 6x6s, nicknamed Jimmy by the soldiers, along with 1.5-ton Dodge trucks and various support vehicles. The trucks themselves were monuments to American industrial capacity and a testament to the power of standardization. The GMC CCKW had been designed in 1941 and went into production in 1942. General Motors built more than 562,000 of them during the war years at plants across the United States. Each truck required approximately 2,500 parts, manufactured by suppliers in dozens of states, then assembled on production lines that operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The 6-cylinder engine produced 91 horsepower and could push the loaded truck to 45 miles per hour on good roads. The 6-wheel drive system gave it remarkable mobility on muddy or damaged roads. The truck could ford water 3 feet deep, climb a 60-degree grade, and with proper maintenance cover hundreds of miles without major repairs. It was not the most sophisticated vehicle ever built, but it was reliable, repairable, and available in vast numbers. But finding trucks was only half the challenge. Ayres needed 46,000 drivers and mechanics, 2 for every truck to allow continuous operations. The demand was staggering. The U.S. Army in August 1944 was chronically short of personnel in non-combat roles. Combat units always received priority for manpower. Service and support units made do with what was left. The solution came from an uncomfortable reality of American military segregation. The Quartermaster Corps, where approximately 75% of personnel were African American soldiers, became the primary source of drivers. The U.S. military in 1944 remained rigidly segregated by policy and prejudice. Military planners, influenced by racist assumptions that had no scientific basis but deep cultural roots, had relegated most black soldiers to service and support roles. The prevailing belief among white military leadership was that African Americans lacked the intelligence, courage, and discipline needed for combat operations. These beliefs, which would later be thoroughly disproven, shaped personnel policies throughout the war. What was intended as discrimination would inadvertently create an opportunity for these soldiers to make a contribution so vital that even their most bitter critics would be forced to acknowledge it. Private Washington Rector of the 3916 Quartermaster Truck Company was one of the thousands of young black men pressed into service for the Red Ball Express. Years later, he would recall the moment his unit received orders with crystal clarity. They knew something big was happening. Officers were rushing around with an urgency they had never seen before. They were told they were going to be driving supplies to General Patton's armies, and that if they failed, the advance into Germany would stop. They didn't have to be told twice what was at stake. They understood immediately. This was their chance to show what they could do, to prove that the racist assumptions about their capabilities were lies. Sergeant James Ruckard of Company C, 514 Quartermaster Regiment, another African-American driver, remembered the briefing differently but with equal vividness. The white officers who addressed them were honest about the danger in a way that was almost shocking. They told them the roads would be under observation by German aircraft. They told them they might run into German patrols or ambushes. They told them the trucks were going to break down and they would have to fix them on the road, often under fire. Then they told them that none of that mattered, that the supplies had to get through no matter what obstacles appeared, and that they were the only ones who could do it. Some of the men were scared, Ruckard remembered, but most felt something else, something they had been denied their entire lives in segregated America. Pride. They were finally being asked to do something that truly mattered. Private David Hatcher, who would drive for the Red Ball Express throughout its existence, came from a sharecropping family in Mississippi. He had grown up driving tractors and farm trucks on dirt roads. When he was drafted, the Army had assumed he would be suited only for manual labor. Instead, his driving experience made him valuable. Years later, he would tell his grandchildren that being selected for the Red Ball Express was the first time anyone in authority had ever told him he was good at something important. On August 25, 1944, at first light, the Red Ball Express began operations. The initial route ran from Saint-Lô, connected by road to the port at Cherbourg, southeast to Chartres, a distance of approximately 125 miles. 2 parallel highways were commandeered and marked with red balls painted on signs every few miles. The northern route carried loaded trucks heading east toward the supply dumps. The southern route carried empty trucks returning west toward the supply depots. Military police from the 793 Military Police Battalion were stationed at every major intersection with clear orders to keep the highways clear of all civilian and non-Red Ball military traffic. Any vehicle not displaying the Red Ball insignia was to be turned away, regardless of rank or urgency. The trucks began rolling at dawn, and within hours the operation had established its pattern, a pattern that would continue with only minor modifications for the next 83 days. Convoys theoretically consisted of a minimum of 5 trucks, spaced 60 feet apart, moving at a regulated speed of 25 miles per hour. In reality, the careful plans drawn up in the 36-hour planning session began disintegrating almost immediately. Individual trucks began departing Normandy as soon as they were loaded, unable to wait for full convoys to form. Drivers, responding to urgent demands from combat commanders and to their own desire to prove themselves, disabled their engine governors to push speeds well above 50 miles per hour on straight stretches of road. The 60-foot spacing collapsed as drivers bunched up for mutual protection or spread out to reduce dust. The careful plans gave way to organized chaos that somehow, improbably, worked better than the orderly system that had been envisioned. On August 29th, just 4 days after operations began, the Red Ball Express reached its absolute peak of efficiency and scale. 132 truck companies, operating 5,958 vehicles, carried 12,342 tons of supplies forward to the advancing armies. It was a single-day record that would never be matched during the operation's 83-day existence. That day proved that the impossible was possible, that American logistics could support an advance that military theorists had declared unsustainable. That day vindicated every assumption Allied planners had made about American industrial capacity and organizational ability. The German reaction to the Red Ball Express evolved from disbelief to grudging respect to something approaching despair. Major Friedrich Weber, intelligence officer with the 15th Army, interrogated several captured American drivers in early September. His report, discovered in captured German documents after the war, revealed the Wehrmacht's dawning realization of what they faced. The prisoners were uniformly African American, leading to initial assumptions that they were colonial troops from French Africa. Further interrogation revealed they were American citizens serving in supply units. They described a supply operation of staggering scale. Each prisoner claimed that thousands of trucks were engaged in continuous operations. They spoke of supplies being transported in quantities that seemed impossible to German officers, accustomed to chronic shortages. Most striking to Weber was their morale. Despite being relegated to non-combat roles by their own army's racial policies, they expressed fierce pride in their contribution. One prisoner stated flatly that without their efforts, General Patton's advance would halt within days. German interrogators initially dismissed this as propaganda or boasting. Subsequent events proved it accurate. Weber's report noted another troubling detail that German commanders were recognizing across the front. The American trucks are all identical. They appear to be mass-produced on an industrial scale we cannot match. Our own motor transport consists of dozens of different models, many captured from occupied countries, each requiring different spare parts and maintenance procedures. The Americans have standardized their logistics to a degree that gives them operational advantages we cannot overcome. Additionally, their trucks are demonstrably more reliable than our own vehicles, despite being driven at abusive speeds over poor roads. The contrast between American and German logistics was even more stark than Weber realized. In August 1944, as the Red Ball Express moved thousands of tons daily using motorized transport, German divisions in France were still heavily dependent on horse-drawn wagons for supply and artillery movement. Of the 264 German divisions active in November 1944, only 42 were armored or mechanized. The rest relied on horses. Approximately 1.1 million horses were serving in the Wehrmacht at any given time during the war. A typical German infantry division required approximately 4,000 to 6,000 horses for transportation of supplies and artillery. The horses required fodder, water, veterinary care, and rest. They could not maintain highway speeds above a walking pace. They could not operate continuously. They represented a logistical system from an earlier era attempting to compete with 20th century industrial warfare, and failing catastrophically. Oberst Heinrich Müller, a staff officer with Army Group B, wrote in his journal about watching an American supply convoy from a concealed observation post near Verdun in September. His entry captured the psychological impact of witnessing Red Ball operations. The procession continued for 3 hours without interruption. He counted more than 800 trucks, all moving at high speed, all carrying full loads, all identical in appearance and capability. Behind German lines, their supply columns struggled to move a fraction of that tonnage using a combination of trucks, horse-drawn wagons, and requisitioned civilian vehicles. They had calculated that the Americans could not sustain an advance beyond their railheads. They were wrong. The Americans did not need railheads. They had created a river of supplies that flowed continuously. This was not warfare as Germans understood it. This was industrial production applied to military operations, and they had no answer to it. For the men actually driving the trucks, the Red Ball Express was simultaneously the most important and the most grueling experience of their military service. The standard round trip from Normandy to the forward supply dumps took 54 hours as the front moved deeper into France and the distances increased. Drivers were supposed to rotate, with one man driving while his partner slept in the cab. In practice, both men often stayed awake for the entire run. One drove while the other acted as lookout for German aircraft, enemy patrols, or road hazards. Sleep deprivation became chronic and dangerous. Corporal Charles Johnson of the 783 Military Police Battalion, one of the few African-American MPs assigned to traffic control on the Red Ball route, recalled the relentless flow with a mixture of admiration and concern. The trucks never stopped. Day and night, night and day, in an endless cycle. They would be directing traffic at an intersection, and the same drivers would pass them going east with full loads, then 12 hours later pass them going west with empties, then 12 hours after that heading east again with full loads. Some of these men were driving 72 hours straight, stopping only to refuel, eat, or fix breakdowns. They saw drivers asleep at the wheel with their partner steering from the passenger seat. They saw men so exhausted they could barely climb out of the cab when they finally stopped. But they kept rolling because they understood what failure would mean. The physical toll on drivers was immense and cumulative. Private David Hatcher of the 3715 Quartermaster Truck Company described a typical run with the matter-of-fact tone of someone recounting routine hell. You would load at the beach or at Cherbourg. Heavy boxes of ammunition that could crush your fingers if you weren't careful. Jerrycans of gasoline that sloshed and leaked. Crates of rations that had to be stacked just right, or they would shift and overbalance. 5 tons in the back, and you had better tie it down properly because you were going to be moving fast on rough roads, and if the load shifted it could flip the entire truck. Then you would join the convoy heading east. The dust was so thick you couldn't see more than 1 or 2 trucks ahead. If you fell back, you lost the convoy, and had to find your own way using maps that were often outdated or inaccurate. The roads were torn up by thousands of trucks and tanks that had passed before you. You would hit potholes at 40 miles per hour that would nearly throw you through the roof, even with the cab's minimal suspension. The steering wheel would fight you for hours as you struggled to keep the heavy truck on roads that were never designed for this kind of traffic. Your arms would cramp, your back would ache, your hands would develop calluses on top of calluses. But you couldn't slow down because there were 20 trucks behind you and they couldn't pass on the one-way route. And if you slowed down, they all slowed down, and that meant supplies slowed down. And that meant men at the front went without ammunition or food. And that was unacceptable. The mechanical challenges were constant and varied. The GMC trucks were reliable by the standards of their era, but driving them at sustained high speeds over poor roads pushed them far beyond their design specifications. Tires wore out at catastrophic rates. By the end of the Red Ball Express's 83-day run, more than 40,000 truck tires had been destroyed, worn down to the canvas, or blown out entirely. Clutches burned out from constant shifting and hard starts. Transmissions failed from being pushed at maximum speed. Brakes overheated and failed on downhill grades, forcing drivers to use engine braking and prayers to slow down. Trucks overloaded with supplies that exceeded the 5-ton limit regularly overturned on curves, spilling ammunition or gasoline across French highways, and sometimes killing or injuring their crews. Sergeant Thomas Hall of the 3598 Quartermaster Truck Company became an expert at field repairs through necessity rather than choice. They carried spare parts in the cab, crammed into every available space. Tools were strapped to the outside of the truck, secured with wire. When something broke, and something always broke eventually, you pulled over as far off the road as possible, fixed it as quickly as possible, and got back on the road. The supply dumps had ordnance teams that could help with major repairs, but usually you couldn't afford to wait. He learned to replace a clutch in 45 minutes, working by the side of the road with traffic roaring past. He replaced so many tires he could do it in complete darkness, working by feel. The trucks took a brutal beating, but they kept running if you kept them maintained. The German trucks they occasionally saw broken down by the roadside were a different story entirely. They looked like they had been assembled from mismatched spare parts. American trucks were all the same. If one broke down beyond field repair, you would flag down another truck, transfer what supplies you could carry, and hitch a ride. The trucks were replaceable, the supplies had to get through, the dangers were not merely mechanical. German air power, though greatly diminished by August 1944 compared to earlier years, still posed an episodic threat. Luftwaffe fighters and fighter bombers made occasional strafing runs on Red Ball convoys when weather and opportunity permitted. Trucks loaded with gasoline or ammunition made especially tempting targets. A single well-placed burst of cannon fire could turn a truck into an inferno. Some drivers sandbagged the floors of their cabs, hoping the extra weight would help them survive mine blasts or shrapnel. Others removed windshields entirely after learning that glints of sunlight on glass could attract German artillery fire from observation posts. Sergeant Levada Hall of the 3715 Quartermaster Truck Company experienced the other major danger German combat patrols attempting to interdict supply lines. His grandson later recounted the story his grandfather told of a convoy that reached a bend in the road near the Belgian border. The first two trucks cleared the bend and were immediately destroyed by a German 88mm anti-tank gun in a prepared ambush position. The rest of the column stopped immediately. The convoy commander, a white captain, ordered them to continue through the ambush without reconnaissance. The drivers, all black soldiers who understood the difference between courage and suicide, told him they would only proceed if he led them in his jeep. The captain considered the implications of that challenge for a long moment, then found an alternate route. Hall said that moment taught him something important. Courage was not about following orders blindly. It was about understanding when orders would get you killed unnecessarily and finding a better way to complete the mission. The racial dynamics of the Red Ball Express were complex, contradictory, and often painfully absurd. The U.S. Army's segregation policies remained rigidly enforced, even as black and white soldiers worked toward the same objective of defeating Nazi Germany. Black drivers were required to serve in segregated units, sleep in segregated quarters when they had time to sleep at all, and face discrimination even while performing duties that white officers acknowledged as essential to victory. Private Washington Rector recalled the bitter irony with the weary frustration of someone who had lived it. They were told not to fraternize with white soldiers during off-duty hours. Maintaining segregation was considered important even in a combat zone. But on the road, when you were carrying ammunition to white combat units that needed it to survive, suddenly nobody cared about your skin color. The white infantry would cheer and wave when they saw Red Ball convoys coming with supplies. They knew those supplies meant they could keep fighting, keep advancing, stay alive. But once the trucks had unloaded and headed back west, drivers were supposed to remember their place in America's racial hierarchy. You accepted it because that was the only way to serve your country. But you never forgot the contradiction, never stopped feeling the injustice of it. Some white Red Ball drivers, a minority of the workforce but present nonetheless, later reported being shocked to learn that most of their fellow drivers were black. The routes were so long and operations so continuous that different units rarely interacted directly. Harold Emmerich, a white driver from Ohio, told of informing another soldier that he drove for the Red Ball Express. The soldier looked at him with obvious surprise and asked why he wasn't black. The question revealed how thoroughly the Red Ball had become identified with African American soldiers even during its brief existence, and how segregation created ignorance even among those serving in the same operation. The friction between black and white drivers occasionally became more serious than mere surprise. Multiple veterans recalled incidents of white drivers deliberately trying to prevent black drivers from passing them on the roads, using their trucks to block or intimidate. These actions created dangerous situations in what was already a hazardous operation. The Army, focused entirely on maintaining supply flow, generally ignored these incidents, unless they resulted in actual accidents or significant delays. Yet there were also moments of genuine respect that transcended the racial barriers of the era, moments that hinted at what could be possible in a less prejudiced future. An armored division commander, whose identity was not recorded in official documents but whose words were preserved in unit histories, credited the Red Ball drivers with enabling his tankers to continue operations. Those black drivers delivered gasoline under constant fire. He wouldn't want their job. They had what it took. A tank driver from the 5th Armored Division stated plainly that without the Red Ball they couldn't have moved forward. They were all black drivers, and they delivered in the heat of combat. Tankers would be in their fighting vehicles praying for the Red Ball to come up with fuel and ammunition. General Patton, whose racial views were typical of his generation and Southern upbringing, nonetheless recognized the essential contribution of the Red Ball Express to his operational success. He told his staff, that the 2.5-ton truck was their most valuable weapon. While this praise stopped short of explicitly acknowledging the race of most drivers, it represented a grudging recognition from a man not known for praising service troops. Patton understood that tanks without fuel were expensive sculptures, artillery without ammunition was useless metal, infantry without rations could not fight. The humble supply truck, driven by men his society considered inferior, made his famous advances possible. By early September, the Red Ball Express faced its ultimate test. Patton's Third Army, having raced across France at unprecedented speed, ground to a sudden halt near the Moselle River, tantalizingly close to the German border. The problem was not German resistance, though that was increasing as defending forces fell back toward the fatherland. The problem was gasoline. Patton had requested 400,000 gallons for continued operations. He received 32,000 gallons. The Third Army's tanks, which had been averaging 60 to 80 miles per day through August, sat immobile with empty fuel tanks. The most aggressive army in the Allied force was stopped not by enemy action but by logistics. The supply crisis of September 1944 became one of the most controversial decisions of the entire European war. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, faced an impossible choice with profound strategic implications. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery demanded priority for supplies to support his advance through Belgium, toward the Rhine and the industrial Ruhr, arguing that a single concentrated thrust could end the war quickly. Patton demanded supplies to continue his drive through Lorraine toward the Saar, arguing that his momentum could carry him to the Rhine before German defences solidified. The Red Ball Express, despite its heroic efforts and remarkable achievements, could not supply both axes of advance simultaneously. The trucks themselves were breaking down in increasing numbers. Tyre stocks were nearly exhausted. Spare parts were running dangerously low. The distance from Normandy to the front had increased to nearly 400 miles, doubling the round-trip time and halving the effective tonnage that could be delivered. Eisenhower chose to prioritize Montgomery's Operation Market Garden, the ambitious airborne operation designed to seize bridges across the Rhine in Holland and open a route into northern Germany. Patton's Third Army received minimal supplies and was ordered to go on the defensive and consolidate positions. The decision remains intensely debated by historians. Market Garden failed catastrophically in mid-September, costing 17,000 Allied casualties and accomplishing none of its objectives. Patton believed passionately that if he had received the supplies to continue his August momentum, he could have reached the Rhine by early September and possibly forced a crossing before German defences were properly organised. Whether this assessment was realistic or merely Patton's characteristic overconfidence remains unknowable. What is certain is that the stalling of Patton's advance in September led directly to the grueling fall and winter campaigns, including the bloody fighting in the Hürtgen forest and the surprise German counteroffensive in the Ardennes that became known as the Battle of the Bulge. For the Red Ball Express drivers, September brought new challenges layered on top of existing hardships. As the front stabilized and then advanced more slowly, the route was extended to supply depots across eastern France and into Belgium. The round trips grew to 72 hours or more. Drivers who had been exhausted in August became walking zombies in September, surviving on cigarettes, coffee, and the knowledge that their work still mattered desperately. Accident rates climbed as fatigue-addled drivers dozed off at the wheel or misjudged distances and speeds. The human cost of the operation, never officially tallied, mounted steadily. The Army's response was pragmatic if imperfect. Assign 3 drivers to each truck instead of 2, allowing better rotation. In practice, this meant 3 men sharing a cab designed for 2, attempting to sleep while sitting upright as the truck bounced over broken roads. Corporal James Ruckard described the absurd impossibility of it. You would try to sleep sitting up between the driver and the door. Every time you started to doze off, you would hit a pothole and your head would bang against the roof or the window. You would give up trying to sleep and just talk to keep the driver awake and alert. Then when it was your turn to drive, your partner would try to sleep while you hit the same potholes. It was impossible. They were all running on fumes, physically and mentally. The reward for this sacrifice came in the most basic and welcome form, official recognition from the highest levels of command. In October 1944, General Eisenhower issued a message to Red Ball Express personnel that was read at formation across all the transportation companies. The Red Ball line is the lifeline between combat and supply. To it falls the tremendous task of getting vital supplies from ports and depots to combat troops when and where such supplies are needed, material without which the armies might fail. To you drivers and mechanics and your officers who keep the Red Bull vehicles constantly moving, I wish to express my deep appreciation. You are doing an excellent job. For men who had been told throughout all their lives by American society that they were inferior, that they lacked the intelligence and dedication for important work, these words carried profound weight. Sergeant Thomas Hall kept a copy of Eisenhower's message for the rest of his life, carefully preserved in a worn envelope. It wasn't much, he would tell his grandchildren decades later. It didn't end segregation. It didn't give them the respect they fully deserved. But it was something tangible. It was official recognition that what they did mattered, that they had contributed meaningfully to victory. By mid-November 1944, the Red Ball Express had outlived its necessity, if not its legend. The massive port facilities at Antwerp, captured in early September, finally became operational in late November after engineers cleared the Scheldt estuary of German forces and mines. French rail lines, repaired by engineer battalions working with astonishing speed, began handling increasing tonnages of supplies. Most critically, the pipeline under the ocean, nicknamed Pluto, began delivering gasoline directly from England to forward depots in France, eliminating the need for trucks to haul millions of jerrycans of fuel. On November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express was officially discontinued. Orders went out to all units. The dedicated highways would be returned to mixed traffic. The Red Ball signs would be taken down or painted over. Drivers would return to their original units or be reassigned to other duties. In 83 days of continuous operations, the Red Ball Express had transported 412,193 tons of supplies, according to official records, though some estimates placed the total higher. It had operated at peak strength with 5,958 vehicles. Approximately 23,000 drivers and support personnel had served on the Red Ball routes at various times. 75% of them were African American soldiers who had been given a chance to prove themselves and had exceeded every expectation anyone held. The statistics tell part of the story but miss the human dimension. At any given time during peak operations, approximately 900 fully loaded vehicles were on the road moving east or west in an endless mechanical river. The trucks traveled a combined total estimated at over 120 million miles. They delivered enough gasoline to fuel tens of thousands of tanks, trucks, and other vehicles through hundreds of miles of advances. They delivered enough ammunition to supply dozens of divisions engaged in heavy combat across multiple fronts. They delivered enough rations to feed hundreds of thousands of soldiers. They delivered medical supplies, replacement equipment, spare parts, and thousands of other items essential to modern warfare. The operation had required the establishment of 325 branch camps and numerous supply depots in addition to the main facilities. It had worn out those 40,000 truck tires at a rate that threatened to exceed supply. It had destroyed hundreds of trucks beyond economical repair, simply burning them out through relentless overuse. It had pushed thousands of men to the absolute limits of human endurance, and sometimes beyond those limits. But the statistics and the physical toll failed to capture the most important dimension of the Red Ball Express. It proved conclusively that African American soldiers, when given essential duties and adequate equipment, could perform at the highest levels under the most demanding circumstances. It demonstrated that the racist assumptions underlying army segregation policies were objectively false. Black soldiers were not intellectually inferior. They were not suited only for menial labor. They were not lacking in dedication or capability. They were capable of working under extreme pressure, maintaining complex mechanical equipment, navigating by maps across foreign territory, and sustaining operations that military planners had initially declared impossible. Every mile driven, every ton delivered, every breakdown fixed proved the falseness of segregation's foundational assumptions. The legacy of the Red Ball Express extended far beyond its 83-day operational existence. Other similar supply routes were established across Europe using its organizational model and operational principles. The White Ball Express operated from Le Havre and Rouen to Paris starting in October. The Green Diamond Express moved supplies from Normandy to railheads. The Red Lion Express supplied the 21st Army Group in Belgium. The ABC Express route carried supplies from Antwerp deeper into Belgium and eventually into Germany itself. The XYZ route operated in the final weeks of the war. None achieved the fame or captured the imagination like the original Red Ball, but all used its methods and benefited from lessons learned during those frantic months of 1944. More importantly for American society, the Red Ball Express became part of the historical record that would eventually help end military segregation. When President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in July 1948, ordering the integration of the armed forces, it was supported by evidence from World War II that segregation was both militarily inefficient and morally indefensible. The Red Ball Express stood as irrefutable proof that black soldiers could perform essential duties with skill, dedication, and effectiveness equal to any other Americans. The arguments for segregation, always based on prejudice rather than evidence, could not withstand scrutiny in light of operations like the Red Ball. In the decades after the war, as veterans returned to civilian life and attempted to rebuild their lives, many Red Ball Express drivers found themselves facing the same systemic discrimination they had experienced before and during military service. They were denied benefits promised to veterans. They faced employment discrimination that blocked them from jobs they were qualified to perform. They were often written out of historical accounts of the war or relegated to footnotes. The respect they had earned on the roads of France did not automatically transfer to the streets of segregated America. The country they had served had not finished the work of becoming the country it claimed to be, yet individual veterans kept their stories alive. Some spoke openly about their service, proudly recounting their contribution to victory to anyone who would listen. Others remained silent about their wartime experiences, their stories known only to immediate family. Many faced a complex mixture of pride in what they had accomplished and bitterness at how they had been treated. They had proven themselves under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. They had kept armies moving when everyone said it couldn't be done. They had contributed directly to the defeat of Nazi tyranny, and they had returned home to a country that still treated them as second-class citizens. When Hollywood made a film titled Red Ball Express in 1952, it starred Jeff Chandler and Sidney Poitier, but gave most prominent roles to white actors, effectively whitewashing a story that was fundamentally about African-American contribution to victory. The film took liberties with historical accuracy and downplayed the racial dynamics that were central to the actual experience. Veterans who saw the film had mixed reactions. Some were simply glad the story was being told at all. Others were frustrated that even in telling their story, Hollywood couldn't accurately represent who had actually done the work. In 1985, a reunion of Red Ball Express veterans was held in Louisiana, organized by veterans who wanted to reconnect with comrades and ensure their story was not forgotten. More than 300 veterans attended, traveling from across the country. The vast majority of them were African-American men now in their 60s and 70s, bearing the marks of age, but still carrying themselves with the pride of men who had done something important. They shared stories long held private. They reconnected with men they had served beside 4 decades earlier. They reflected together on what their service had meant, both at the time and in the long decades since. Former Sergeant James Ruckard, who had survived the war and built a successful life despite the obstacles placed before him, spoke to the assembled veterans with emotion barely contained. They hauled anything General Patton needed. They took supplies all the way to the front line, back and forth in an endless cycle. Some of their fellow drivers ran into ambushes and never came home. His own company had been lucky, avoiding the worst of enemy action, though there was shooting all around them constantly. His worst memories were seeing trucks get blown up and being afraid he might be killed any moment. But they kept rolling because they knew that if they stopped, the advance stopped, and men died who might have lived. Former Corporal Thomas Hall, reflecting on the broader historical significance, added his perspective with the wisdom of age. The army hadn't wanted to give them important jobs because of their race. They gave them the Red Ball because they had no choice, because there weren't enough white drivers, because the segregation system left them short of personnel where they needed it most. But once they had the chance, once someone finally gave them an opportunity to prove themselves, they showed what they could do. They proved they could handle responsibility. They proved they could work as hard as anyone. They proved they could contribute to victory in meaningful ways. That, he insisted, was what he wanted his grandchildren to understand. Remember, they weren't given respect because of their race. They earned it, mile by mile, truck by truck, day after day, through actions that could not be denied or dismissed. The veteran who perhaps captured the essence of the Red Ball Express experience most eloquently was Sergeant Washington Rector, speaking at that same 1985 reunion with a voice that carried 4 decades of reflection. Young people today ask what it was like to serve in a segregated army, to fight for a country that didn't treat them as equals, He told them it was hard. He told them it was unjust in ways that should shame the nation. But he also told them they did it anyway, because they believed that if they proved themselves, if they showed what they could accomplish when given the chance, they could help change things for those who came after them. The Red Ball Express wasn't just about moving supplies from one place to another. It was about moving their people forward, about proving that the limitations placed on them by racism were lies with no basis in reality. They couldn't integrate the army by themselves. They couldn't end discrimination by driving trucks. But they could do their part in the larger struggle. They could show that when America needed them most, they would answer the call, even when America didn't always answer theirs. The military impact of the Red Ball Express was acknowledged by commanders on both sides of the conflict. Colonel John Eisenhower, son of the Supreme Commander and himself a career military officer, stated with characteristic directness that without the Red Ball truck drivers, the advance across France could not have been made. General Patton, despite his many personal flaws and prejudices, recognized the fundamental military truth that armor without fuel was sculpture, that infantry without ammunition was helpless, that armies without supplies could not fight. The 2.5-ton truck, he had declared, was America's most valuable weapon, because without those trucks, and the men who drove them with such dedication, all the other weapons became worthless metal. The German perspective, preserved in captured documents and post-war interviews with surviving officers, revealed a dawning understanding that they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of American warfare. General Major Hans von Stackelberg, who commanded a corps on the Western Front and survived the war, wrote in his post-war memoirs with the hindsight of defeat. They had studied American tactics and found them unimaginative compared to German doctrine. They had analyzed American equipment and found it adequate but not superior to German weapons. They had calculated American logistics using their own formulas and organizational assumptions, and concluded Americans could not sustain deep penetrations beyond railheads. They were catastrophically wrong on every count. American tactics worked because they had overwhelming firepower and didn't need tactical sophistication. American equipment was good enough, and they had so much of it that losses meant nothing to their overall capability. American logistics operated on principles Germans did not understand, principles of mass production and standardization that allowed them to generate capacity Germany could not match even in theory. They were a horse-drawn army trying to fight a fully motorized enemy. They were craftsmen facing industrial mass production. They could not win such a competition. The comparison between American and German logistics revealed systemic differences that went far beyond mere numbers of trucks or tons delivered. The Germans in 1944 were fielding dozens of different truck models acquired through various means. Many were captured from occupied countries: France, Czechoslovakia, Poland, the Soviet Union. Others were civilian vehicles requisitioned from German industry. Only a minority were purpose-built German military trucks. Their supply columns consisted of a bewildering mixture of trucks, horse-drawn wagons, and requisitioned civilian vehicles of various vintages and capabilities. Repair depots needed to stock spare parts for French Renault trucks, Soviet ZIS trucks, Czech Tatra trucks, Italian Fiat trucks, and German trucks of various models and years. The logistical complexity of supporting this motley collection was enormous and fundamentally inefficient. The Americans, by contrast, had ruthlessly standardized their logistics. The GMC 2.5-ton truck was the absolute workhorse of their supply system, produced in massive numbers by a single corporation using interchangeable parts. Every truck was functionally identical. Every part fit every truck. Mechanics trained on one truck could repair any truck in the fleet. Supply depots needed to stock parts for essentially one primary model instead of dozens of incompatible systems. When a truck broke down beyond economical field repair, it could be quickly cannibalized for parts to keep other trucks running, then simply abandoned. New trucks were constantly arriving from the United States in numbers that seemed inexhaustible. The entire system was designed for industrial mass production and mass replacement, an approach to warfare that the Germans, with their tradition of craftsmanship and their increasingly constrained industrial base, could not hope to match. The Red Ball Express also highlighted profoundly different approaches to military manpower and human resources. The Germans, chronically short of personnel by 1944, after years of catastrophic losses on multiple fronts, were increasingly dependent on forced labor, Allied forces of dubious reliability, and personnel scraped from every possible source. At some Red Ball supply dumps, German prisoners of war were employed under supervision to perform basic maintenance tasks, checking tire pressure, cleaning windshields, performing simple mechanical work. Some were discovered engaging in petty sabotage, putting water in gas tanks or loosening critical bolts, small acts of resistance that occasionally succeeded in disabling individual trucks but could not stop the overall flow of supplies. The Americans, despite their morally indefensible racial segregation policies, could draw on a deep reservoir of willing volunteers and draftees. African American soldiers, despite facing systematic discrimination, volunteered for military service in large numbers. They wanted to prove themselves capable. They wanted to contribute to defeating fascism abroad even while fighting racism at home. The Double Five campaign, actively promoted by African American newspapers and community leaders, encapsulated this dual struggle with elegant simplicity. Victory over fascism overseas and victory over racism at home. The Red Ball Express became one important arena where this dual struggle was fought and partially won. Time magazine, in an article published during the war years, called the Red Ball Express part of the miracle of supply that sustained American forces thousands of miles from North America. The article noted perceptively that this miracle was deeply rooted in American tradition, a tradition the Germans have never really understood. It was the product of a people accustomed to great spaces, to transcontinental railways, to nationwide trucking chains, to endless roads and millions of private automobiles. The observation captured an important truth. American society in 1944 was already fundamentally a car culture in ways European societies were not. Millions of Americans owned automobiles personally. Millions more drove trucks professionally in civilian life. The skills needed to operate and maintain motor vehicles were widespread in American society in a way they simply were not in German society. The Red Ball Express could draw on this existing base of knowledge and experience, turning civilian skills directly into military capabilities. The Germans, by contrast, remained far more dependent on traditional forms of transportation, even in the mechanized age. In November 1944, of 264 German divisions in existence, only 42 were armored or mechanized formations. The rest relied heavily on horses for transportation and logistics. Some divisions actually had more horses than German divisions in World War I, a regression that spoke volumes about Germany's inability to fully mechanize. The horses required vast quantities of fodder and water. They needed veterinary care. They required rest periods. They could not operate continuously around the clock. They could not maintain highway speeds. They represented a fundamentally 19th century approach to warfare, attempting to compete with 20th century industrial logistics. This contrast was starkly visible to soldiers on both sides when they encountered each other. Allied soldiers advancing into Germany were often genuinely surprised to capture German supply columns that consisted largely of horse-drawn wagons. German soldiers captured after D-Day reportedly asked their American guards in confusion where all the horses were, genuinely unable to comprehend an army that seemed to have no horse transport whatsoever. American guards were baffled by the question. Of course, there were no horses. This was a modern, mechanized 20th century army. The long-term significance of the Red Ball Express extends far beyond its immediate military contribution to Allied victory in Europe. It stands as a powerful historical example of how dire necessity can temporarily break down even deeply entrenched social barriers. The army had relegated African American soldiers to service roles based purely on racist assumptions about capability. When those service roles suddenly became absolutely critical to military success, the men performing those roles became indispensable. They could not be dismissed or ignored or marginalized. Their contribution had to be acknowledged, however grudgingly, by some. The Red Ball Express also demonstrated fundamental principles of military logistics that remain powerfully relevant. Standardization of equipment dramatically reduces maintenance burdens and increases operational efficiency. Industrial mass production allows for equipment replacement strategies rather than complex repair operations. Continuous 24-hour operations require multiple shifts of personnel and careful attention to human factors like fatigue. Supply lines must be actively protected and given operational priority. Logistics fundamentally determine what is operationally possible on the battlefield. Tactical brilliance and strategic vision cannot overcome supply failures. These lessons were learned at great cost during World War II. These hard-won lessons were not forgotten by military planners. The Berlin airlift of 1948, supplying an entire city by air, used similar principles of continuous operations and rigidly standardized procedures. The logistics operations supporting American forces in Korea, Vietnam, and all subsequent conflicts built directly on foundations laid by operations like the Red Ball Express. Modern military logistics, with its emphasis on just-in-time delivery systems, computerized supply chain management, and rapid response capabilities, represents a direct evolution of the same fundamental principles that guided the Red Ball Express. Get the right supplies to the right place at the right time, regardless of obstacles or conventional wisdom. The story of the Red Ball Express ultimately proves a profound truth about human capability and the nature of warfare. The most powerful weapons are not always the most obvious or glamorous ones. Tanks and aircraft and artillery win individual battles through firepower and mobility, but logistics win entire wars through the steady, unglamorous work of keeping armies supplied. The 23,000 men who drove for the Red Ball Express, 75% of them African-American soldiers serving in a rigidly segregated army that doubted their capabilities, never fired many shots in direct combat. But their contribution to ultimate Allied victory was as essential as any frontline combat unit. They kept the advance moving forward when it should have stalled. They prevented the collapse of supply lines that German planners had confidently predicted would doom the Allied offensive. They proved beyond any possible doubt that American industrial capacity, American organizational ability, and American determination could overcome any obstacle. The Axis leaders who had scoffed at American supply capabilities, who had calculated with Prussian precision that the Allies could not possibly sustain advances beyond their established railheads, who had confidently assumed that American logistics would collapse catastrophically under its own weight, learned a bitter and ultimately fatal lesson in the summer and fall of 1944. The Red Ball Express rolled day and night without ceasing, an endless convoy of trucks carrying the supplies that enabled Allied armies to sweep across France, liberate Belgium, and drive deep into Germany itself. The trucks that German planners had dismissed as inadequate became the weapon that made victory possible. The drivers that American segregationists had dismissed as inferior became the heroes who kept entire armies moving forward. When the last Red Ball Express convoy completed its final run on November 16, 1944, it marked the end of one operational chapter, but absolutely not the end of the larger story. The trucks were reassigned to other military duties. The drivers returned to their original units or received new assignments. The highways of France returned to mixed civilian and military traffic. The red ball signs were taken down or painted over. But the legacy of what had been accomplished remained permanent and powerful. Every subsequent American military supply operation built consciously on lessons learned from the Red Ball. Every African-American soldier who later served in integrated units after President Truman's 1948 executive order owed something tangible to the men who had proved through their actions that segregation was based on lies rather than facts. Every military logistician who plans modern supply operations studies the Red Ball Express as a classic example of what can be achieved when necessity drives innovation and conventional wisdom is abandoned. The veterans of the Red Ball Express carried their experiences with them for the remainder of their lives, processing and reprocessing what those 83 days had meant. Some spoke openly and proudly about their service, recounting their contribution to victory to anyone willing to listen. Others remained largely silent about their wartime experiences, their stories known only to immediate family members. Many faced significant discrimination when they returned home to a country that had not yet fully reckoned with its racist legacy. They were denied jobs they were qualified to perform. They faced hostility and violence for trying to exercise rights they had helped defend abroad. The respect they had earned on the dangerous roads of France did not automatically transfer to the segregated streets of America, but they had proven something vitally important to themselves, to their nation, and to history. They had answered the call when their country needed them. They had done the job that supposedly couldn't be done. They had kept rolling when everyone said it was impossible. The magnitude of what had been accomplished during those 83 days becomes even more striking when examined through the lens of operational statistics and human cost. The Red Ball Express had operated an average of 900 vehicles simultaneously on the roads at any given moment. Each truck made multiple round trips during the operation's lifetime, with some vehicles covering over 10,000 miles before mechanical failure or reassignment. The cumulative mileage approached astronomical figures. When maintenance records were compiled after the operation ended, they revealed that Red Ball trucks had traveled more than 48 million ton-miles, a measurement that multiplies tons of cargo by miles traveled to capture total transport work performed. The wear and tear on equipment was catastrophic but acceptable, given the strategic necessity. In addition to the 40,000 tires destroyed, engines required rebuilding at rates far exceeding peacetime norms. Clutches lasted perhaps 1/3 of their expected lifespan. Transmissions failed with alarming regularity. Suspension components broke under the constant pounding. Brake systems wore out and had to be completely replaced multiple times on trucks that continued operating throughout the full 83 days. The American military logisticians had essentially decided to burn out their equipment in exchange for maintaining offensive momentum, calculating correctly that new equipment could be shipped from the United States more easily than stalled offensives could be restarted. The human cost, though never fully quantified in official records, was substantial. Drivers died in accidents caused by fatigue, poor road conditions, and excessive speed. Some were killed by German air attacks or ground fire. Others died when trucks carrying ammunition or fuel exploded after accidents or enemy action. The exact number of Red Ball Express casualties was never officially tallied separately from General Quartermaster Corps losses, but unit histories and veteran accounts make clear that men died to keep the supplies moving. Their sacrifice received far less recognition than combat casualties, but it was no less real and no less essential to victory. Beyond those who died, thousands more were injured in accidents or suffered long-term health consequences from the extreme physical demands. Chronic back problems from the rough riding trucks plagued many drivers for decades. Hearing damage from constant engine noise affected others. The psychological toll of sustained sleep deprivation and constant stress created wounds less visible but equally real. Some veterans struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though the terminology and understanding did not exist in 1944. They had nightmares about trucks exploding, about falling asleep at the wheel, about letting down the men at the front who depended on them. The operational challenges extended beyond simply driving trucks over long distances. The Red Ball Express required a massive supporting infrastructure that often goes unmentioned in popular accounts. Quartermaster depots at both ends of the route had to operate around the clock, loading and unloading thousands of tons of supplies daily. Ordnance teams had to maintain repair facilities capable of handling major mechanical work in field conditions. Military police had to staff traffic control points continuously. Fuel depots had to dispense hundreds of thousands of gallons of gasoline to keep the trucks themselves running. Communication systems had to track thousands of vehicles and coordinate their movements. Medical facilities had to treat injured drivers and deal with illness caused by exhaustion and exposure. The French civilian population, caught between retreating Germans and advancing Allies, witnessed the Red Ball Express with a mixture of relief, amazement, and sometimes frustration. The convoys took over roads that civilians desperately needed to use for their own purposes. The noise and dust from thousands of trucks disrupted daily life. Accidents occasionally involved civilian vehicles or damaged property. Yet most French civilians understood that these convoys represented an liberation moving forward. They were willing to endure the inconvenience because it meant freedom was coming. Some French civilians went beyond mere tolerance to active assistance. Mechanics in French towns offered to help repair broken-down trucks. French guides sometimes led convoys through alternate routes when main roads were blocked. French families occasionally fed exhausted drivers at their own tables. These acts of kindness and solidarity created bonds between American soldiers and French civilians that lasted beyond the war. Many Red Ball Express veterans returned to France in later decades, seeking out the towns and villages they had passed through, trying to recapture something of that extraordinary time. The legacy of the Red Ball Express in military logistics doctrine cannot be overstated. The operation demonstrated conclusively that sustained motor transport could replace rail lines under the right circumstances, a lesson that influenced post-war military planning across multiple nations. It proved that standardization of equipment was not merely convenient but strategically essential. It showed that human factors like fatigue management and morale maintenance were critical to sustained operations. It validated the concept of dedicated supply routes with priority access. Every one of these lessons was incorporated into military logistics planning in subsequent decades. The Vietnam War saw similar operations on an even larger scale, with truck convoys moving supplies through hostile territory. The Persian Gulf War of 1991 relied heavily on massive truck logistics to position supplies for the rapid ground offensive. Modern military operations in Afghanistan and Iraq have used the same basic principles, adapted for new technologies and different terrain. The Red Ball Express remains a case study in military education institutions worldwide, examined for its successes and its challenges. The racial dimension of the Red Ball Express also left a complex legacy that extends beyond military history into the broader American civil rights movement. The men who drove for the Red Ball Express returned home to a country still deeply segregated. They had proven their capability and dedication in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. They had earned the respect of commanders and fellow soldiers, but they came home to a South where they could not drink from certain water fountains or eat at certain restaurants. They came home to job discrimination and housing discrimination and voting restrictions, yet their service had planted seeds of change. When the civil rights movement gained momentum in the 1950s and 60s, World War II veterans, including many who had served in operations like the Red Ball Express, were often at the forefront. They had seen a wider world. They had proved themselves under fire. They were less willing to accept second-class citizenship quietly. The connection between World War II service and civil rights activism has been documented by historians. The Red Ball Express drivers who became civil rights leaders may not have been numerous, but they were influential in their communities. The integration of the U.S. military, which began officially in 1948 but took years to implement fully, owed something to the Red Ball Express experience. When defenders of segregation argued that integrated units would be less effective, supporters of integration could point to operations like the Red Ball Express where black and white soldiers had worked toward common goals with documented success. The argument that racial integration would harm military effectiveness became harder to sustain when confronted with actual evidence from wartime operations. The contribution of the Red Ball Express to ultimate Allied victory can be measured in multiple ways. Most directly, it prevented the supply crisis of late summer 1944 from becoming catastrophic. Without the Red Ball, Allied forces would have been forced to halt their advance for weeks or months, while rail lines were repaired and port facilities were opened. That delay would have given German forces time to establish stronger defensive positions, to reorganize their scattered units, to bring reinforcements from other fronts. The war in Europe might have extended into 1946 instead of ending in May 1945. The additional months of warfare would have cost thousands or tens of thousands of additional Allied casualties, not to mention the continued suffering of occupied populations and concentration camp prisoners. Less directly, but no less importantly, the Red Ball Express maintained Allied momentum at a critical psychological moment. In late August and early September 1944, there was a widespread belief among Allied soldiers and commanders that the war might be won quickly. This optimism was perhaps excessive, but it drove aggressive operations that kept German forces off balance. If supply shortages had forced a prolonged halt, that psychological momentum would have been lost. German morale would have been boosted by the sight of Allied forces stopped short of the German border. The Red Ball Express, by keeping supplies flowing forward, maintained the pressure that prevented German forces from reorganizing effectively. From the German perspective, the Red Ball Express represented something deeply demoralizing beyond mere military logistics. It demonstrated American industrial capacity in the most concrete possible way. Every German officer who witnessed or heard reports about the endless convoys of identical trucks moving at high speed had to reckon with what that meant for Germany's strategic position. If the Americans could support their armies with such lavish logistics hundreds of miles from their bases, what hope did Germany have of ultimate victory? The psychological impact of American logistical superiority on German morale, while impossible to quantify precisely, was undoubtedly significant. The story of the Red Ball Express also illuminates broader truths about the nature of modern industrial warfare. The romantic image of warfare emphasizes individual heroism, tactical brilliance, and dramatic battlefield victories. These elements certainly mattered in World War II, but the mundane reality of modern warfare is that industrial production capacity, logistical organization, and sustained material superiority often matter more than tactical skill. Germany had excellent generals, well-trained soldiers, and often superior weapons at the individual level. What Germany lacked was the industrial base to sustain prolonged warfare against opponents who could outproduce them, while simultaneously maintaining logistics over vast distances. The United States in 1944 was producing trucks at a rate that would have seemed impossible to German planners a decade earlier. General Motors alone built more trucks during World War II than the entire German vehicle industry produced during the same period. American factories were protected from bombing by thousands of miles of ocean. American workers were well-fed and comparatively well-paid. American industrial production could focus entirely on output without worrying about immediate survival. These advantages, more than any individual battlefield decision, determined the war's outcome. The Red Ball Express was a visible manifestation of these underlying realities. Every truck that rolled through France represented not just that single vehicle, but the entire American industrial system that had produced it, the training system that had prepared its driver, the organizational system that directed its movements, and the national will that sustained the war effort. German officers who grasped this larger picture understood that they were not just fighting American armies, they were fighting American factories, American oil wells, American agriculture, American transportation systems, and American organizational capacity. It was a fight Germany could not win. The men who drove the trucks understood their role with varying degrees of sophistication. Some saw themselves simply as drivers doing a job that needed doing. Others understood the larger strategic significance of what they were accomplishing. Almost all understood that they were proving something important about themselves and about African Americans generally. The combination of individual pride, unit pride, and racial pride created a powerful motivation that sustained men through exhaustion and danger. They were not just driving trucks, they were making history. They were proving capabilities that had been denied and doubted. They were contributing to victory in ways that could not be dismissed or minimized. When historians evaluate the decisive factors in Allied victory in Europe, they typically emphasize the Soviet Union's absorption of the main German military effort, the strategic bombing campaign that crippled German industry, the successful invasion at Normandy, and the overwhelming material superiority of the Allied forces. All of these factors were undeniably important, but logistics made all of them possible. Without adequate logistics, the Normandy invasion force could not have been assembled and supplied. Without logistics, the armies that broke out of Normandy would have stalled short of Germany. Without logistics, tactical victories would have been meaningless, because armies cannot fight without supplies. The Red Ball Express, in its 83 days of existence, kept logistics functioning at a critical moment when the entire Allied campaign in Western Europe could have been derailed by supply failures. It was not the only logistics operation, and it was not the longest or largest in absolute terms. But it came at a crucial time, it succeeded against significant odds, and it provided a template for subsequent operations. Its historical significance extends well beyond its specific contribution to tonnage delivered. For the African American drivers who participated, the Red Ball Express represented both an opportunity seized and an injustice highlighted. They seized the opportunity to prove themselves, to demonstrate capability and dedication under the most demanding circumstances. They did work that was acknowledged as essential even by those who doubted them. They earned respect through performance, but the very fact that this was necessary, that they had to prove basic humanity and capability in 1944, highlighted the profound injustice of American racial segregation. They should not have needed to prove themselves. Their capabilities should have been assumed, as white soldiers' capabilities were assumed. The fact that proving themselves was necessary revealed the depth of American racism. This tension between pride in accomplishment and anger at injustice characterized the experience of many Black World War II veterans. They were proud of what they had done. They were glad to have contributed to defeating Nazi Germany. But they were also frustrated and angry that their own country continued to treat them as second-class citizens. This tension helped fuel the civil rights movement in subsequent decades. Veterans who had proved themselves in wartime were less willing to accept peacetime discrimination. They had seen other countries, met other people, experienced life outside American racial hierarchies. They returned home changed, less willing to accept the status quo, more determined to fight for their rights. The Red Ball Express stands as a symbol of this complex reality. It was a triumph of organization and determination. It was a demonstration of African American capability. It was an essential contribution to military victory. And it was a reminder that even essential contributions did not automatically translate into equal citizenship or equal respect. The men who drove the Red Ball Express were heroes of the war effort. They deserved better than they received from their country, both during and after the war. Their story is simultaneously inspiring and troubling, a reminder of both human capability and human injustice. Axis leaders had scoffed at American supply lines, secure in their mathematical certainty that logistics would defeat the Allied advance more effectively than any battlefield victory. They had calculated based on their own experiences and limitations, assuming Americans would face the same constraints. The Red Ball Express provided the definitive answer to that scoff, an answer delivered in the unmistakable form of thousands of trucks rolling day and night, carrying the vast quantities of supplies that sustained the liberation of Europe. The drivers who kept those trucks rolling, working themselves to exhaustion, facing constant danger, overcoming every obstacle, stand forever as proof that ordinary people, when given truly important work to perform, are capable of extraordinary achievements that reshape history. Their legacy endures not just in military history books, but in every successful logistics operation that followed, in every step forward toward racial equality in American society, and in every story of individuals who defied low expectations to prove their worth through dedication and action rather than words. The Red Ball Express was born of military desperation, executed with unwavering determination, and succeeded far beyond any reasonable expectation. In 83 days of continuous operations, it moved 412,000 tons of supplies over millions of miles, helping decisively to win the war in Europe. More importantly for human history, it proved that the ideological foundations of Nazi Germany, including the belief in racial superiority, the confidence in German organizational excellence, and the assumption that their enemies were too weak and divided to defeat them, were built on sand rather than fact. The trucks that rolled relentlessly day and night through France carried more than gasoline and ammunition and rations. They carried irrefutable proof of what free people, working together across racial lines despite persistent prejudice, could accomplish when united by a common cause against tyranny. The Axis leaders learned too late, when learning no longer mattered for their survival or their cause, that they had scoffed at precisely the wrong enemy. The supply lines they dismissed with contempt held firm under pressure. The logistics they confidently predicted would fail succeeded brilliantly beyond all projections, and the drivers they would have considered racially inferior, African-American soldiers working in the most segregated army in the entire Allied coalition, proved themselves to be among the war's most essential and effective contributors to ultimate and total victory. They did not just drive trucks, they drove history forward. They proved capabilities that racism had denied. They demonstrated that character and competence have nothing to do with race. They showed what America could be when it lived up to its ideals rather than its prejudices. The Red Ball Express was their story. And through their dedication, their sacrifice, and their success, they made it America's story and the world's story as well.